For what, almost a century, law enforcement and the courts had the blood alcohol content, BAC.
Right.
It was a straightforward, scientifically predictable number. It defined impairment. You knew scientifically and legally exactly where you stood.
A neat little package.
But now, with legal cannabis expanding everywhere, that rigid, predictable foundation has just completely crumbled.
It's the core of the problem, and it's so counterintuitive to everything we thought we knew about, toxicology and the law.
Yeah.
Our Deep Dive mission for you today is to really unpack this fundamental scientific disconnect. Scientists, law enforcement, they still lack a reliable, forensically defensible roadside test for marijuana impairment.
Now, without a clear scientific standard.
You get this critical intersection of public safety on one side and personal rights on the other. And frankly, it's just a volatile legal mess.
So our mission, specifically, is to figure out why. Why does that simple BAC model fail so completely for cannabis? We're going to examine the current, often shaky legal frameworks being used right now in 2025 to try and prosecute these cases.
And then we'll get into the exciting part.
The high-tech, multi-million-dollar race to create the definitive weed breathalyzer, or some kind of objective functional test that can actually stand up to scientific scrutiny in court.
And the stakes could not be higher. I mean, this is not just about writing traffic tickets.
Yeah.
This affects every driver, every employer, and every policymaker in places where cannabis is legal or, soon will be.
And we have some pivotal research to talk about, specifically an analysis from the Association for Diagnostics and Laboratory Medicine, the ADLM.
And they warn, and this is a direct quote, that current legal standards risks sending innocent people to jail.
Innocent people to jail.
Simply because the test results being used do not correlate with actual real-time impairment. We need a fair, functional solution, and we need it fast.
Because right now, the legal system is basically prosecuting a chemical presence, not a functional risk.
Exactly.
So let's start with the hard science, because this is really the foundation. It's why the alcohol model fails so spectacularly for cannabis.
It all comes down to what scientists call pharmacokinetics.
Which is just a fancy way of saying
how the body absorbs, distributes, metabolizes, and, gets rid of the substance.
Right. And when you look at alcohol, ethanol, it's kind of the predictable straight-A student in this chemistry class, isn't it?
It is the textbook definition of predictable drug behavior. Ethanol is highly water-soluble. Chemists call it hydrophilic.
So when you drink it, it just distributes evenly throughout all the water in your body.
Uniformly. And critically, its movement is tied directly to its effect. So peak blood concentration.
Lines up almost perfectly with peak cognitive impairment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when your BAC hits that 0.08% limit, you are scientifically and demonstrably at your most impaired. Your blood level is the perfect proxy for that effect.
And because the body gets rid of it in this fixed, linear way, what's called zero-order kinetics, they can easily back-calculate your BAC from the time of the test to the time you were actually driving.
It's elegant. It's standardized. And for legal purposes, it works flawlessly.
Okay, now let's compare that scientific certainty to delta-9-THC, the main psychoactive component in cannabis.
THC is the true wild card. It's the disruptive force in toxicology. It's a large molecule, and it's highly fat-soluble, lipophilic.
Meaning it hates water.
It hates the watery environment of your bloodstream. So the moment it gets in there, it treats your blood like a hostile place. It races out of the bloodstream to sequester itself in fatty tissues.
And most importantly,
the highly vascularized fatty tissue of the brain and the body's other fat deposits.
So the blood concentration just drops like a stone almost immediately. It's like it's fleeing the scene of the crime, chemically speaking.
Precisely. This is the absolute core scientific disconnect that just invalidates these per se laws. Our sources show that blood concentrations drop, and I quote, exponentially and precipitously within minutes of consumption.
Wow.
They can decrease by over 90% in the first hour alone.
90%. But here's the paradox, right? During that exact same hour, the user's functional impairment might only just be reaching its peak.
That's it. The THC is binding to the CB1 and CB2 receptors in the central nervous system. The effect is happening in the brain, not the blood.
So, okay, let's paint a picture. If I smoke and I get pulled over 20 minutes later, my blood test might read, say, 100 nanograms per milliliter.
A very high number, yes.
But if the test is delayed by an hour and a half while the officer is, processing the scene, what happens to that reading?
That reading might now be down to 5 ng/ml, even though you, the driver, are still impaired, or perhaps even more impaired because the chemical has fully reached your brain.
So the highest chemical concentration in the blood does not equal the highest functional impairment.
Not at all. It's a measure of exposure, not effect. THC's quick escape to the brain and its rapid clearance from the blood means the timing of the sample is everything.
And roadside timing is notoriously.
Variable,
Yeah.
uncontrolled. If you miss that narrow window, the evidence is meaningless.
Yeah.
Or, even worse, it's misleading.
And that rapid escape from the blood leads directly to the famous leaching problem. This is what creates the false positives that can send a sober person right into the criminal justice system.
The leaching problem is the inevitable consequence of that high fat solubility. Once THC is stored in that fat tissue, your body slowly releases it back into the blood as you metabolize fat.
So for a regular chronic user,
It means THC, or its non-psychoactive metabolites,
yeah,
can be detected in your blood or urine for days, weeks, sometimes even months after the intoxicating effects have totally vanished.
you can be stone cold sober, but your body is still just slowly leaking evidence of past consumption.
And this is where the legal system just runs into a catastrophic wall of injustice, particularly for regular consumers.
You could be legally driving to work on a Tuesday, having last used cannabis on Friday night, and still legally fail a drug test that was designed to catch someone who is actively impaired.
And we have the data. This isn't just anecdotal. We have pivotal data that proves this is a systemic risk.
This is that critical study from the University of California, San Diego, right? In collaboration with the ADLM.
That's the one. They analyzed 190 regular cannabis users who were strictly instructed to abstain for 48 hours, 2 full days of sobriety.
So what did they find? What did the test show after that 48-hour sober period?
The findings were deeply concerning. They just showed the sheer failure of these fixed concentration thresholds. Despite being sober for 2 days,
Yeah,
43% of those individuals still exceeded zero tolerance threshold.
43%.
And here is the truly terrifying legal statistic. Over
Uh-huh.
5% still exceeded the 5 nanogram per milliliter per se limit.
And that 5 NGML threshold is the magic number in key states like Washington, Colorado, Illinois.
And exceeding it is often treated as prima facie evidence of driving under the influence, a serious, sometimes felony-level offense.
Wait, let's just stop on that 5% figure for a moment. 5% of people who were demonstrably sober, who had abstained for 48 hours, still exceeded the legal threshold used to put people in jail.
That is the core scientific indictment of the current legal standard.
You are prosecuting a chemical reading that reflects past behavior, not current danger.
Exactly. The presence of cannabinoids in your bodily fluids provides little, if any, information concerning behavioral impairment, especially in chronic users who develop a behavioral tolerance to those lingering low concentrations.
So the legal standard, which was built on the assumption that a chemical concentration equals impairment,
The successful alcohol model.
is just fundamentally built on pseudoscience when you apply it to THC.
It is.
This brings us to the variable duration of impairment. If the test timing is so crucial, we need to know what that acute impairment window actually is. It varies based on how you consume, right?
It does. And that adds just another layer of complexity. If you inhale, the acute impairment comes on really quickly. A meta-regression analysis suggests that functional impairment would take about 7 hours to subside after inhaling a standardized 20 milligrams of THC.
7 hours. That's a long time. If I smoke at 10 p.m., I might still be functionally impaired at 5 a.m. the next morning.
That's the cautionary data point. Now, if you consume edibles or oral oils, that impairment period can be significantly longer. You've got slower absorption, delayed peak effects in the GI tract.
But there's also data on the other side of this, isn't there?
There is. We have to look at all of it. Other controlled studies, including later work from UCSD, found that simulated driving decrements from smoked cannabis generally appeared to resolve by 4 hours and 30 minutes in most individuals.
But that was specifically for experienced users who are controlling their own intake.
A very important distinction, yes.
So we've got this range, somewhere between 4.5 and 7 hours. That range itself is critical because it just highlights the need for functional testing over chemical readings. But the drivers themselves, they're often the worst judges of their own state.
Oh, absolutely. The same UCSD study that cited that 4.5-hour resolution time also noted that the participants' perceived willingness to drive increased rapidly.
How rapidly?
68% of them reported they felt ready to drive just 1 hour and 30 minutes after smoking.
Even though their measurable driving performance
Had not yet improved from its initial post-smoking low point. That indicates a really dangerous false sense of safety.
And that distinction, the difference between feeling sober and being functionally safe, is the precise gap that technology needs to fill.
The consensus is that the acute risk window is measured in hours, not in days or weeks, which is what traditional blood and urine tests would suggest.
Okay, so if the chemistry of THC makes the alcohol model basically irrelevant, we need to analyze the two main tools that law enforcement is relying on right now across North America to secure convictions for cannabis-impaired driving.
And demonstrate why they are both, frankly, failing the scientific and legal test in 2025.
Let's start with the one that tries to mimic the alcohol success story, the per se standard. As you mentioned, many U.S. states use these fixed chemical thresholds, like 2 or 5 nanograms per milliliter, and just crossing that line is considered evidence of impairment.
This is the easiest tool to dismantle scientifically. The assumption behind it is that just like alcohol, higher concentrations mean higher impairment.
But the evidence against that correlation is
Overwhelming. Just consider the systematic review published in January 2024 by Bazad and his colleagues. They synthesized data from 12 different controlled driving studies.
And what did that broad review find, looking at concentration versus actual impairment?
The finding was unambiguous. 10 of those 12 studies reported no significant linear correlation between blood THC concentration and objective measures of driving performance.
We're talking about critical metrics here, like weaving or lateral control.
The inability to maintain a straight line, the exact driving behavior that leads to accidents.
So the whole idea that as my blood level doubles from 5 ngml to 10 ngml, my driving gets twice as bad, that simple linear relationship that works perfectly for alcohol, it just does not hold up for cannabis.
It does not. The lack of that linear correlation means that the 5 ngml threshold is, essentially arbitrary. It lacks the scientific backing to tie it to a specific measurable risk level for the general population.
Now, we do have to clarify one thing for our listeners. While the concentration doesn't correlate well with the degree of impairment, using cannabis does still elevate your overall crash risk, doesn't it?
It does, and that is a really important nuance. Epidemiological studies show an elevated crash risk associated with cannabis use. They've measured an odds ratio of about 1.32.
Which means a driver with THC in their system is about 32% more likely to be in a crash compared to a sober driver.
It's a real risk factor. We have to take it seriously.
But let's put that 1.32 odds ratio into context so you can really grasp the magnitude of the difference compared to the standard we all accept, which is alcohol.
Right. Let's be really clear here. The risk associated with driving at the legal limit of 0.08% alcohol is an odds ratio of 13 for fatal crashes.
13.
To put it simply, driving with THC detected carries an elevated risk, but driving drunk at the 0.08% threshold is statistically 10 times more dangerous according to these accepted metrics.
And there are even some studies, culpability studies, that have struggled to show a significant increase in crash risk even when THC is above that 5 ngml threshold.
That's right. These are the studies that try to figure out who is actually at fault in a collision. And even they have a hard time pinning down a specific risk increase tied to that specific number.
So the science gives us this sort of low-level risk factor, but it fails completely to provide the quantifiable, repeatable chemical measure that the justice system demands.
Which leads us directly to the second enforcement tool, the one that's used precisely because the chemical reading is so unreliable.
The drug recognition expert, or DRE, protocol.
When chemical tests for THC are unavailable or are scientifically unreliable for timing the acute impairment, which, as we've established, is basically always the case, for cannabis law enforcement relies on DREs.
These are officers who've had specialized training.
Right. They use a structured 12-step psychophysical evaluation. They're examining the suspect's eyes, their pulse, their gait, muscle tone, reflexes, all to build this paper trail of observations that they claim allows them to categorize the type and degree of drug impairment.
On the surface, it sounds rigorous, a standardized evaluation. But critics have called this entire process into question, arguing it's just inherently subjective.
The criticism is trenchant. Critics, and here we're talking about prominent scholars like Dr. William J. McNichol, argue the DRE protocol is, in fact, an elaborate exercise in confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias.
The protocol trains officers to find specific indicators, and they rely on subjective observations that lack medical standardization. A DRE will cite classic signs of stimulus, like an elevated pulse and blood pressure.
But the intense stress and anxiety of a traffic stop and then this intimidating 12-step evaluation
Can fully account for those exact physiological signs, completely independent of any drug use.
And then there's the notorious moment where science delivered this huge specific blow to the DRE manual, focusing on one specific sign they're trained to look for.
The eyelid tremor.
The eyelid tremor.
This is a perfect example of how specific scientific testing can just invalidate an entire enforcement regime. DREs are trained to observe eyelid tremor during Step 6, the Modified Romberg Balance Test.
And they cite it as a classic, subtle neurological indicator of recent cannabis impairment.
The theory is that it reflects real-time disruption in the central nervous system.
And it sounds authoritative in court. The expert observed the telltale sign of eyelid tremor. But what did the peer-reviewed science actually find?
A critical 2024 study in clinical toxicology by Wang and colleagues investigated this claim under strictly controlled conditions. They used blinded medical experts, high-definition video analysis, all to eliminate observer bias.
And their conclusion?
It was devastating for the DRE program. They found no statistically significant association between recent cannabis consumption and the presence of eyelid tremor.
No association.
In fact, the data showed that cannabis users were slightly less likely to exhibit tremor than non-users.
Less likely. So a trained indicator is not only functionally meaningless, it might even be counterindicative. Let's translate this into practical terms. The study found the test had a specificity of only 0.18. What does that number mean for you, the listener, in a real scenario?
Specificity measures a test's ability to correctly exclude non-users, to return a negative result when a person is truly negative. A perfect test has a specificity of 1.00.
And this one is 0.18.
Which is extremely poor. It means that if you tested 100 people who had not consumed cannabis, only 18 of them would be correctly identified as negative for the sign.
And the other 82.
The remaining 82 would either exhibit the tremor for completely unrelated reasons, or the DRE would subjectively perceive one. The test is highly unreliable for excluding non-users, which means a positive finding is functionally meaningless for diagnostic value.
That is profound. It means relying on that tremor observation is basically a coin toss, highly dependent on the subjective training of the officer. What's the legal impact of this scientific collapse?
Well, the legal system is reacting strongly. This weakness has led to successful legal challenges all across the U.S. Courts in places like Minnesota are increasingly prohibiting DREs from even being called experts in the courtroom.
So their testimony is reduced to that of a lay witness.
Exactly. They can only describe their observations. The driver swayed and had a red eye. But they can no longer render an expert opinion on the category or specific degree of drug-induced impairment. The whole foundation of this subjective protocol is crumbling, which is forcing a reliance on objective measures.
So given that the fixed chemical thresholds are scientifically flawed and the DRE protocol is judicially suspect, the imperative is clear. Technology has to bridge this gap between just detecting something and proving actual impairment.
And we are seeing a high-stakes, high-tech race right now focused on two key approaches: chemical isolation via the breath and functional measurement via cognition.
The immediate goal is to mimic the simplicity of the alcohol breath test. I mean, if we could get a reliable THC reading roadside, that would solve half the legal problem because it gives us a highly indicative measure of recent use.
But the technical challenge here is immense. It's what they call the needle in a haystack problem.
Let's elaborate on that. Why is a cannabis breathalyzer so much harder to engineer than an alcohol one?
The mechanism of exhalation is fundamentally different. Alcohol is volatile, it easily turns into a gas, and you exhale it as a gaseous vapor. THC is not.
It's a heavy, sticky, lipid-based molecule.
Right. It's carried out of the deep lungs only on microscopic, submicron aerosol particles. These tiny droplets exhaled from the lung lining.
And engineers have quantified this difference.
They have. A single breath from an alcohol consumer contains roughly 1 million times more ethanol molecules than the number of THC molecules you'd find in a dozen breaths from a cannabis user.
1 million times more.
We are looking for trace elements measured in parts per trillion.
That sensitivity requirement, parts per trillion, is just astounding. It's like searching for a single grain of sand in a swimming pool. But several key players are making rapid progress, focusing on this acute window. Let's look at Hound Labs first.
Hound Labs is one of the leaders. Their tech is focused on isolating those aerosol particles and detecting THC at that parts per trillion level. The key is timing.
They're trying to solve the problem of acute impairment by proving recent use.
Exactly. And research from the University of California, San Francisco, which provided some early validation for this technology, demonstrated some pretty impressive results in capturing that narrow window.
How narrow are we talking?
It suggested really high detection rates for very recent use. 100% detection between 15 and 60 minutes after consumption.
And then what happens?
Crucially, the detection rate plummeted to 0 after 6 hours. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, confirmed this rapid decay. They showed that THC concentrations in breath drop roughly 95% within just 3 hours of consumption,
And that data is the entire selling point, isn't it? Because it clears so fast. If the test is positive, it must have been consumed in the last few hours.
making it highly relevant to acute impairment and completely sidestepping that leaching problem.
So Hound Labs is focused on the quick roadside reading that helps an officer establish probable cause, or maybe even provide a quantifiable roadside limit someday.
Exactly. But another major player, Cannabis Technologies, with their marijuana breath test, or MBT, takes a slightly different approach. They're focusing heavily on forensic reliability and court challenges.
Tell us about Cannabis.
Cannabis is all about sample integrity. Their handheld breath collection unit, the BCU, isn't designed to give you an immediate definitive result roadside.
So what does it do?
It's designed to capture a stable, pristine breath sample. The sample gets collected in a special cartridge that can then be sent for the gold standard forensic lab analysis.
Which is known as liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry, or LC-MSMS.
Right. We should probably clarify that jargon for you.
Yeah, what is LC-MSMS and why is it the gold standard you need for court?
It's the highest standard of chemical analysis. First, it uses liquid chromatography, the LC part, to separate all the complex chemical components in the sample. Then, it uses tandem mass spectrometry, the MSMS, to precisely identify and quantify those components down to the nanogram level.
It's required because it confirms not only what chemical is there,
But it ensures it's the exact substance claimed, delta-9 THC, not some related chemical, and it confirms the concentration with extremely high reliability. Cannabis is trying to give law enforcement a simple roadside collection tool that yields court-ready evidence.
and they recently passed a major regulatory hurdle, the FCC and ISD electronic emissions testing. Why is that so important for a drug test?
It's crucial. These are complex electronic instruments being used by governments. They have to confirm that the device operates safely and reliably in all environments.
So its electronics won't interfere with other police equipment.
Or, more importantly, that external electronic noise won't compromise the integrity of the sample collection. Passing those FCC and Canadian ISD tests in late 2025 was a major step toward commercialization. It shows the device is robust and legally compliant as a piece of high-tech government equipment.
So if breathalyzers are the future, what about what's currently being deployed? We have oral fluid saliva screening devices already on the market.
We do. Devices like the Abbott Cytoxa mobile test system and the Draeger Drug Test 5000 are in use internationally and in various U.S. pilot programs.
And they're designed for quick roadside screening, a result in about 5 minutes.
Right. They're used to establish probable cause for a subsequent, more invasive test, like a blood draw. And they typically use a set concentration threshold in the saliva, say 5, 10, or 25 ng/ml, to flag a positive result.
And we have some crucial data from the 2024 Minnesota pilot project that shows both the effectiveness and the major legal limitation of these oral fluid screens.
Yes, the Minnesota Office of Traffic Safety used these devices on drivers who were already arrested. And it's important to note, the results were explicitly not used for probable cause to make the initial arrest. It was just for data collection.
And across 329 tests, what did they find?
They found drug-positive results in an alarming 87.2% of cases. Cannabinoids were the most common, along with methamphetamine and amphetamines.
That does seem like a powerful tool for detection, but what did the data reveal about polysubstance use?
That was the most alarming public safety finding. 62% of those positive tests detected more than one drug in a single person.
Wow.
It just confirms the high dangers of polysubstance use on the road, where the combined effects can be catastrophic. But, legally speaking, the major distinction was reinforced by the Minnesota report itself,
Which was?
that a positive oral fluid test is strictly an indicator of recent drug use. It is not an indicator of impairment.
And they had cases to prove this.
They did. The report noted 17 specific cases where a drug recognition expert found no signs of impairment in the driver, yet the oral fluid test was positive for one or more drugs.
So the chemical test confirmed presence, while the human assessment, flawed as it may be, confirmed a lack of functional effect.
And that's why the objective chemical test is failing to measure effect. It's forcing this push toward purely functional measurement. Cognitive testing.
If chemistry is unreliable, we have to measure function directly.
Exactly. And this is where tablet-based neurocognitive apps like DRUI come in. These are designed to measure objective, repeatable factors like reaction time, divided attention, tracking ability, and impulse control.
So instead of asking, what is your THC level, they ask,
Can you safely perform complex, divided attention tasks right now?
so how does that system work? What are they measuring?
They're essentially running standardized, repeatable video game-like tasks. They're designed to engage the parts of the brain we know are affected by cannabis, particularly in the prefrontal cortex,
A classic test would be something like divided attention.
where you, the driver, have to track a moving object while simultaneously responding to random stimuli. It's a core requirement for driving. And crucially, these digital tests aim to compare your current performance against either a standardized population mean or, ideally, your own historical baseline.
The idea of a personal historical baseline is really powerful, isn't it? It just bypasses the problem of individual tolerance entirely.
It's the game changer. If I am a regular user and I've developed a high tolerance, my baseline reaction time might be, say, 300 milliseconds. If I test at 350 milliseconds after consumption, I might not be impaired relative to the general population.
But you are impaired relative to your own safe driving state.
Exactly. This technology focuses on the individual's functional capacity, and it circumvents the need to argue about arbitrary chemical thresholds or subjective physical observations.
Finally, we have to briefly touch on a systemic crisis that threatens to undercut all forensic toxicology right now, regardless of the testing method.
The lab reliability crisis.
The lab reliability crisis.
It's a vital and often overlooked point that just speaks to the need for standardization. When criminal charges proceed, they rely on the accuracy of certified labs. But a November 2025 study in Colorado by a group called Ripple highlighted some critical systemic inconsistency.
They sent identical cannabis samples, concentrates, and flour to various state-certified labs for testing.
They did.
And what was the variance they found in the official THC potency results?
The THC potency results for the exact same concentrate varied by up to 38%.
38%.
Think about that, 38% variation on the exact same sample. That massive variance is often more than double what state law generally allows for batch-to-batch testing.
That is just astonishing. What does a 38% variance mean legally for you, the listener?
It has profound legal implications. It means a criminal charge, or a clearance, could depend entirely on which certified laboratory happened to handle the forensic sample.
And this variance comes from?
A lack of certified reference materials, matrix effects in these complex cannabis samples, inconsistencies in lab extraction and calibration techniques. It just underscores the urgent need for federal-level standardization and oversight similar to the ironclad standards used for measuring alcohol in blood.
Otherwise, the integrity of every single cannabis-related prosecution is potentially compromised?
Absolutely.
The policy and legal frameworks are clearly struggling to adapt to the velocity of this scientific uncertainty and all the technological advancements we just discussed.
Right, so let's look at how major jurisdictions are responding, both globally and domestically. And we're seeing two vastly different regulatory philosophies emerge.
Internationally, we see Canada doubling down on strict enforcement, while Germany is pivoting toward evidence. Let's start with Canada's strict approach, which is embodied by Bill C-46.
Canada maintains one of the most punitive per se approaches, despite all the scientific ambiguity we've demonstrated. Bill C-46 is radical because it allows mandatory roadside saliva screening even without reasonable suspicion that the driver has consumed cannabis.
So an officer can pull me over and administer a drug test just based on the fact that they're conducting a random stop without needing to see me swerving or observe red eyes.
That's correct. It essentially treats cannabis screening similar to random breath testing for alcohol in certain jurisdictions.
And if that roadside oral fluid device shows a positive result, which, remember, only indicates recent use,
the officer can then demand a mandatory blood draw. And exceeding that 5 ng/ml blood drug concentration, or BDC, carries mandatory minimum fines and potential jail time for subsequent offenses.
So the Canadian model is focused heavily on deterrence and simplicity.
Perhaps consciously sacrificing scientific accuracy about impairment correlation to achieve a tough-on-crime posture.
Okay, now let's contrast that approach with Germany's evidence-based pivot. They actually looked at the science and made a huge change.
Germany recognized the inherent scientific flaws of these low concentration limits. So following an extensive review by an expert commission, they announced a major policy shift in June of 2024.
They raised their blood serum driving threshold from a near zero 1 ng/ml all the way up to
3.5 ng/ml.
Why that specific number? Why 3.5?
The commission's rationale was based on aligning the legal standard with the threshold where scientific evidence suggests a tangible, statistically significant risk of impairment across the general population. They chose 3.5 NAGML as the concentration where the likelihood of measurable impairment begins to separate significantly from the performance of sober drivers.
So it was a clear, evidence-based decision. It's designed to protect people from wrongful prosecution based on those lingering, non-psychoactive levels of THC.
While still protecting public safety above the proven risk threshold. And they also instituted a strict ban on combining THC with any amount of alcohol.
Recognizing that multiplicative danger.
Precisely. They recognized that mixing central nervous system depressants creates an exponential danger far exceeding the risk of either substance used alone. Germany is actively trying to use toxicology to define the law, rather than using law enforcement policy to define the toxicology.
Domestically, here in the U.S., the most significant change isn't necessarily happening on the highway yet, but in the workplace, particularly in California.
California's new laws, AB 2188 and SB 700, which became effective on January 1, 2024, represent a major legal reform. They prohibit employers from discriminating against applicants or employees based on off-duty, off-site cannabis use.
And this directly challenges decades of workplace policy that was centered on zero-tolerance drug screening.
It does.
And the key distinction here is what kind of test employers can now legally use. They can't just rely on those old legacy urine screens anymore, can they?
Absolutely not. And this is the mechanism that forces the technology shift. The law forces employers to use tests that detect only the psychoactive component, the active delta-9 THC, and it explicitly prohibits relying on tests that screen for non-psychoactive metabolites.
Explain why testing for metabolites is now considered illegal discrimination in this context.
Metabolites like THC-COH are the non-psychoactive breakdown products of THC. Standard urine or hair tests screen for these because they're so easy to detect for weeks after use. So by screening only for metabolites, an employer is essentially firing someone for what they did on their own time last weekend, even if they show up to work on Monday completely sober.
Yeah.
The law demands employers move their testing from simply detecting past presence to demonstrating current, real-time psychoactivity or impairment.
Which necessitates the use of oral fluid or breath testing or functional cognitive tests.
Exactly.
But safety-sensitive jobs still require traditional testing, right? There are exemptions.
That's correct. Crucial exemptions. The law does not apply to employees who must be tested under federal mandates, specifically the Department of Transportation, or employees in the building and construction trades.
Which recognizes the high safety and liability risk associated with those roles.
Right.
That brings us back to the DOT mandate, which is immense. It governs millions of safety-sensitive transportation workers. We heard they are moving toward oral fluid testing, but the implementation has been very slow. What's the holdup?
The U.S. Department of Transportation, the DOT, has authorized oral fluid testing as a scientifically valid alternative to urine testing for their workers. They published a rule in late 2025 regarding the procedures. The system is paralyzed by bureaucratic necessity. The DOT is legally required to wait until the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, certifies at least 2 oral fluid laboratories.
Why 2? Why isn't one enough?
The 2-lab requirement is central to forensic integrity in the U.S. federal system. Federal drug testing requires a split sample.
Meaning the collected specimen is immediately split into 2 containers.
Right. If the primary sample is positive, the employee has the right to have the second, or split, sample tested at an entirely separate, certified laboratory for confirmation. This process protects the integrity of the evidence and provides due process.
So until HHS certifies at least 2 labs that can handle this split sample procedure,
the DOT cannot fully implement the new, scientifically preferred oral fluid method. And so the highly intrusive and time-consuming directly observed urine test remains the mandated default for many situations.
So even the federal government, which recognizes the scientific validity of oral fluid testing that detects recent use, is stalled by the need to establish a rigorous, legally defensible, standardized infrastructure.
It just shows how incredibly difficult it is to change the legal and infrastructure frameworks that underpin forensic toxicology.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the core conflict remains incredibly stark. Technology is getting so close to detecting recent use with systems like Hound Lab's quick reading and Cannabis's forensic collection.
But the fundamental legal problem of proving actual impairment remains stubbornly linked to these outdated, scientifically invalid chemical thresholds and subjective human assessments that are now being routinely challenged in court.
And the scientific community has issued a clear roadmap for resolving this, but it requires a complete shift in leadership and funding.
Right. As articulated by scholars like McNichol, Policy control needs to move away from law enforcement dominance and over to the substance use science community, the toxicologists, pharmacologists, statisticians, and engineers who actually understand the nuances of the wild card that is THC.
And he lays out specific, actionable steps needed for reform that connect science directly to public funding. What are the key priorities we must demand?
First and foremost, there has to be dedicated, rigorous scientific research to develop and validate new psychomotor and cognitive tests specifically for cannabis.
These tests have to be standardized, portable, and transparently tested for their error rates.
We need to know that if the app says you're impaired, you are functionally impaired. And second, McNichol advocates for an obvious and, I think, morally appropriate funding source.
Which is?
Dedicate a significant portion of the substantial tax revenue generated by legal marijuana sales directly to fund this critical road safety research. We need to align the cost of legalization with the scientific solution to the safety risks it creates.
The ultimate goal, then, is to jettison these unreliable chemical readings, the per se limits that are prosecuting sober people, and replace them entirely with objective functional measurements that actually tell us if a person is safe to drive right now.
Regardless of their tolerance or how many days ago they last consumed, we have established that impairment cannot be inferred solely from blood concentration. The current 5 ngml limit captures sober, regular users, and the DRE protocol's scientific credibility is collapsing under judicial scrutiny.
So the only truly fair and accurate path forward is this integration of ultra-sensitive sensors for recent consumption and real-time functional tests that can accurately assess critical driving skills.
Skills like divided attention and reaction time, comparing your performance against your own proven safe baseline.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. Given the speed of technological development from parts per trillion breath detection to functional cognitive tests, and the overwhelming legal pressure from wrongful convictions based on bad science, how quickly will governments be forced to abandon all chemical per se limits for cannabis?
Will science finally mandate that we rely exclusively on real-time, objective measures of functional impairment? And what does this pivot mean for the future of roadside and workplace safety testing globally? The answer will define road safety for the next generation.